Thank you for tuning in to the history of psychotherapy. What we're going to be talking about over the course of the next few slides is how psychotherapy has evolved from a largely unregulated practice. That was a weird word. Unregulated was the word there. Unregulated practice to one that has come under scrutiny, that has overcome that scrutiny, and today sits as a profession where the results of our work are largely acknowledged as being effective and largely acknowledged as an integrated part of healthcare. Over the course of our slides, and as I said, as part of our course in general, we're going to talk about multiculturalism as we go through this. We can't ignore that the history of psychotherapy, like a lot of things, is centered in white America, Eastern practices, Eastern philosophies, Eastern worldviews. So I'll try to talk about how that has impacted the history of psychotherapy, both in its past and how it may be changed moving forward. So you've had a number of different readings so far over the course of the semester. If we go back to week 1, or preparing for the first week of class, you had readings from Wampold, who reviewed the psychotherapy theory, the historical context. You had a reading from Lillian Comaz Diaz, who looked at the role of looked at multicultural psychotherapy, and looked at that both from a current as well as a historical context. And then finally, you had a more recent article from Goldfried, who looked at why we have not been able to come to consensus in psychotherapy, and he outlined some of the things that kind of have held us back traditionally, and some of the things that he suggests we can do moving forward to bring us to a greater consensus as a field. I want to start out here with kind of 7 observations that I have when I read through that. And in class, I'd like to discuss kind of these observations and some of the other observations that you might have had about the history of psychotherapy and where it's gone and where we're going. In the second week of course, you picked up on this reading and looked at kind of what I would consider to be where the psychotherapy state of the art is at. So what is the current state of psychotherapy, how we view evidence-based practice, what that means, and how we might implement that. We'll come to that later in our slides here. But I want to start with the 7 kind of broad observations, again, that I take away from these readings, and I think that are important as we look at the history of psychotherapy. I titled this slide with a title that honestly dates back to my graduate school days. And I remember having a vivid discussion with some of the 4th-year students, and I was complaining about Freud and the psychodynamic and analytic and why we were learning about that. And one of the 4th years kind of turned to me and said, like, it's really easy for you to sit here and think that you know more, but you have to recognize the fact that you're standing on the shoulders of those who have come before you. And of course, you can see further and more than those people ever have. So I like to take that framework when I think about where I'm at, where we're at as a field, and how others have kind of contributed to what I know and what we will know going forward. So on to those 7 observations. Number 1. You have read over and over again, Goldfried talks about this specifically, about the tension between science and practice. You are from a scientist practitioner program, and ultimately what that means is that you integrate science into your practice and that you use the best scientific evidence in providing treatment for your clients. As we all know, this is aspirational and not always something that we're able to do as a field. Practitioners often feel siloed into their world and think they know what's going on. And you'll hear the phrase, I don't know if it's a phrase, but you'll hear it often said, well, yeah, it's easy to sit in academia, do research, and never see any clients and think you know what you're talking about. Scientists on the other side will say, well, we know exactly about human behavior, what's going on, what makes psychotherapy effective, and why don't these people that are in actual practice use it? I'm not going to be able to solve that this semester. Sorry to bury the lead, but it is something that we'll kind of continue to talk about and something that you've read about and something that I'll be interested to hear what you all think about. The second thing is the role of religion and spirituality. I talked early about this being, our history is, based on white, Eurocentric, Eastern kind of philosophical and worldviews. And when we talk about the history of psychotherapy, oftentimes psychotherapy was delivered to individuals of privilege, not just white, but white privileged individuals. So people who had money. There was no health insurance to kind of pay for this in the early days of psychotherapy. Where did other people get help? Oftentimes, and I don't have the opportunity to go into the history of the world, if you will, in our class and helping, but oftentimes individuals turn to religious leaders, spiritual leaders, and religion and spirituality may be different things, but leaders within the community, religious leaders, spiritual leaders, respected elders. And it would be silly for us to think that help wasn't being given in those contexts. And we've slowly started to incorporate the idea that religion, spirituality, and helping and healing occurs in many different contexts. And we need to learn and incorporate all of those different contexts when we talk about helping others. The third theme, and this one's a very clear one, you read in you read in your readings. That sounds stupid, but you read about the role of psychotherapy and how it was directly tied to medicine. In fact, Freud, often misunderstood or not known, as Freud was a physician, um, and the legitimacy of Freudian psychoanalysis and psychotherapy was clearly evident through the acceptance and integration of that into the medical profession. Unfortunately or fortunately, depending on how you look at it, a lot of what we do is still tied to the medical model, and that has good things and bad things to it. But we first kind of achieved that legitimacy through medicine. And I feel, and again, happy to talk about this and think about this more together, in some ways we're trying to pull back a little bit from medicine. And all of you will encounter the I don't know, difficulties of dealing with psychotherapy and with helping clients within a medical profession because our views can be very different at times in relationship to our clients. The fourth theme, the explosion of theory and technique. That's not and technique, that's and technique. As you read about again, we started and really kind of our predominant theories to begin with were psychodynamic and analytic, and then the humanistic theories, and then the cognitive theories, and then the behavioral theories, and then the cognitive theories. And then we've seen just an explosion of different theories, different treatments, different techniques. You'll see the numbers in various different documents. Some people have estimated that at least 500, if not more, different, distinct theoretical approaches and technical approaches to psychotherapy exist. So if I had to teach you each of those, and I had 1 week for each of them, which is idealistic in and even of itself to teach you one theory and get you proficient, I'd have to have you for 500 weeks, right? I love you all. I don't want to see you for 500 weeks, and you don't want to see me for 500 weeks, right? The point here is there's a lot of different theories and techniques, and how do you make sense of that? As a beginning therapist in particular, what do you do with that? And we'll talk about some of that as we move forward. The fifth thing, evidence-based treatment, empirically supported treatments, and evidence-based behavioral practice. These are all terms that you've read about over the last 2 weeks. They are similar yet different. One of my favorite essay questions, one of my favorite qualifying exam questions or content areas is exactly what these things are and what their differences between them what the differences between them are. Evidence-based treatments and empirically supported treatments are largely the same thing. What we're talking about is taking a particular treatment practice, package, technique, and providing evidence for the fact that it works. Evidence-based behavioral practice is a whole different thing. And this is the kind of key thing that I want you to key into here. That was one too many keys there. Then one of the things that I want you to pay attention to is what the difference between evidence-based behavioral practice and evidence-based treatments or empirically supported treatments are. And as you should know, by the end of this week, evidence-based behavioral practices incorporate empirically supported treatments, but a lot more. So evidence-based treatments, empirically supported treatments are one part of evidence-based behavioral practice. Evidence-based behavioral practice, I said that correct, but there's a whole lot more to it. And we'll talk about that later within this lecture. Sixth, and this is a weird one, dissatisfaction and change. I think the field of psychotherapy has evolved over time in like many new sciences. And as a reminder, psychology in and of itself and clinical psychology, we're at 100, 150 years old. It may sound like a lot of time for you as a younger person. It's not, right? I mean, it's really like for me, that's my grandparents, right? As to when this kind of started to become something. And even talking about my family and my family's mental health history, it was largely psychiatry even back then. There wasn't really psychotherapy was a kind of beginning thing back in my grandparents' day. Actually, to be honest with you, beginning in my parents' day. So we're really not talking about a field and a science that is old. It's really kind of in its adolescence, if you will. So there's a lot of change. There's a lot of dissatisfaction with the current way of thinking about some things. And that provides both a dynamic, interesting area, but also as a beginning therapist, somewhat confusing landscape. It's like, somebody tell me what to do, right? If I see this symptom, give me an antibiotic. The antibiotic will fix it and we'll be all better. Well, that's not quite where we're at as a science. We're close in some areas, but not necessarily there. So to me, it's part of why I love this field, because it's both dynamic, interesting, invigorating, and then also confusing and frustrating at times. All right, so our last thing here, and it's something that I'll repeat and we'll talk about over and over again, is the dominance of Eastern and white culture throughout our history. I don't know that I have more to say about this at this point in the lecture other than to recognize it, and to recognize that some of what we know, if not all of what we, well, all of what we know at this point is too extreme. But certainly in our history, a lot of what we have known, a lot of what we have done is based on white, Eastern, affluent cultures. And so we want to kind of constantly challenge ourselves to think about how we're thinking about things, the worldview in which we're seeing things through, and how things may have to be adapted, changed, to meet the needs of a more inclusive world that we're living in, period. So I could go on, but I'll just leave it there because the slide is getting long. So I'll leave it there as something that we can continue to talk about and something that we'll continue to look at throughout the course of our semester together. So before we close out this first part of our lecture, what I want to do is to talk to you a little bit about the history prior to where we're at today, and to kind of give you a context to understand where we've come from and what things were like previous to our current struggles to understand psychotherapy and psychotherapy effectiveness. So let me start with the early 1900s to 1960s. And again, you might go, oh, wait, why are we starting in the 1900s? Well, to be honest with you, some of it is the scope of our time in our class. Some of it is the fact that psychotherapy itself and psychology as a science wasn't firmly established prior to this time. So there's a lot that can be said. There's a lot of interesting history. I would encourage you to read it about kind of healing and what healing meant, not only in the American culture, but in different cultures. There's really, really interesting stuff on that, just outside the scope of what we're going to talk about, or what we have the time to talk about. I label these the glory years in some way. And what I simply mean by the glory years is that psychotherapy largely went unchecked. Psychotherapists did their work. They thought it was effective. Their clients thought it was effective because they kept coming to them. And they largely gained legitimacy through, number one, their growing tie to medicine, but also just the general public sense of this is interesting, it's important, it's helpful. Those are the glory years. Around 1952, those glory years kind of came to a crashing end, and I make that sound dramatic. It wasn't like Hans Eysenck's seminal work came, the field came crashing down. But one of the things that Eysenck did was he published a paper, and in that paper he said, he concluded that the available data, and this is a quote, fail to support the hypothesis that psychotherapy facilitates recovery from neurotic disorder. Well, the glory years were over. And what psychotherapy and psychotherapists found themselves at was at a crisis point. This kind of called into question the legitimacy of psychotherapy as a science, as a practice, and in essence kind of said, yeah, these people are charlatans. I almost said guys there because there was predominantly white males at the time. But these people are charlatans. They're not doing anything that is actually effective. And what this led to is a number of people within the field taking up the challenge and saying, look, you know what, we've gotten by for a while. And it's time that we really kind of look at what we're doing and to prove that, in fact, it is effective. This led to a number of research projects. Sorry, let me go back. I can't go back. Anyways, this led to a number of kind of people, a number of scientists kind of taking up the mantle of like, is psychotherapy effective? A number of different projects that looked at psychotherapy in relationship to a placebo control, which was often like being in a room with someone who was caring about you, looking at psychotherapy in relationship to nothing at all. So if we treat you with psychotherapy versus give you nothing, is psychotherapy better? And then eventually some that looked at different psychotherapies to see which one are more effective. One of the seminal articles that came out was Smith, Glass, and Miller in the 1980, I think it was actually literally 1980. And one of the things that Smith, Glass, and Miller were able to do, which wasn't available to them before that, was to do a meta-analysis. You all think of, oh, meta-analysis, that's like standard fare, we see those all the time. In those days, it was relatively new. Meta-analysis wasn't something that was done. Smith, Glass, and Miller looked at all of the different psychotherapy research that was out there. They did a meta-analysis on all of them. If you don't know meta-analyses, it means that we control for the quality of particular studies. We look at sample sizes. We look at a variety of factors that kind of level the playing field. And what they found is when they looked at good studies that were out there, about 75% of the people that entered into psychotherapy recovered. And that psychotherapy was overwhelmingly better than nothing, and overwhelmingly better than any placebo control that was out there. This may sound like, yeah, okay, to you, but this was groundbreaking at the time, and it really kind of legitimized psychotherapy once and for all as effective. And if anybody really argues like whether or not psychotherapy is effective, there's just mountains and mountains of evidence to indicate that in fact it is. And it's really, in my opinion, not a question right now of is it effective versus how is it effective and what does it actually do. Another pivotal thing in the psychotherapy movement, which may surprise you and you've learned about it in psychopathology, is the introduction of the DSM-3. And this again occurred about the same time that the Smith, Glass, and Miller study came out. And you might go, well, what's the DSM have to do about it? And I would stop and quiz you, like what's the difference between the DSM-3 and the DSM-2? And if you, I don't know how much this is talked about in psychopathology for you guys, but if you were paying attention or if you knew this history, what you would say is the DSM-3 was the first DSM that introduced kind of objective criteria for defining psychopathology. So instead of relying on theory-based models, it really said, look, in order to be a person with a major depressive disorder, you need to meet 5 of 9 criteria over the past 2 weeks, or at least 2 weeks, and those criteria have to have resulted in specific functional impairment for you, blah, blah, blah. All of those diagnostic criteria that you've spent now 2 semesters kind of trying to master. And you might go, well, what the hell does that have to do with psychotherapy? What that has to do with psychotherapy is if I have a good, reliable diagnostic classification system, I can then study treatments that might be associated with those diagnostic criteria. So if I have a good way of diagnosing a person who has social anxiety or social phobia, and I can reliably put those people into a group, then I can deliver a treatment specifically for those individuals and see whether or not it is effective. And this will lead us to looking at some of the initial attempts to validate or support particular treatments, because the focus was at that point of let me define a diagnostic group, let me develop a treatment that helps that diagnostic group, let me provide empirical support for that, and pretty soon we'll have empirical support for all of the different diagnostic criteria. Life will be great and we'll be legitimate practitioners out there in the field. As we'll see, the ideal solution didn't necessarily come to fruition. We'll talk about that in the next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about 2 models, and I'm going to break this lecture into 2 different postings, and I'm going to talk about the first model here, and then I'm going to talk about Toland's model in our second slide. These come from your readings for the second week of class, by the way, just to kind of keep you oriented. As we mentioned in the last slide, one of the things that we wanted to do as a field was to say, can we provide legitimacy for our psychotherapy approaches? And one of the initial ways we tried to do this was to look at what treatments worked for what conditions. And you read about let me see if I can use these fancy tools here. You read about here the APA Division 12 Task Force on the Promotion and Dissemination of Psychological Procedures. This was commissioned by the APA and I think the first report was 1985. So in the early, or I guess mid 80s, going through, I think the second and third reports were issued basically through the decade, so through the mid 80s to the mid 90s. And one of the things that this task force was commissioned to do was to say, let's look at the available evidence and let's put out a list of what we considered at the time, they used the word empirically validated treatments. There's a nice historical article about what's wrong with the term empirically validated that you can read through if you have the time, and later became known as empirically supported treatments. And one of the first things that this task force did was to say, well, how do we define this? What in fact is an empirically supported treatment? And their first kind of attempt to this was to define what they called a well-established treatment. And this was commissioned by the Division of 12 of APA, by the way, which is the Division of Clinical Psychology, which I would encourage you all to get active in and become a student member of at this point. One of the things, why is my clicking not working? There we go. One of the things that Division 12 did is in establishing what is a well-established or empirically supported treatment is they define these criteria, and you looked at these in your readings. What they did was to say, well, we have to have at least 2 good group design studies conducted by different investigators. That's important. Demonstrating the efficacy in one or more of the following ways. So it's either superior to a pill, oh, there's my cat, superior to a pill, hi baby, superior to a pill or psychological placebo, and equivalent to an already established treatment that is out there in the field. So let's talk about those things specifically. A group design study, meaning that we have to have a group of people with a particular diagnosis. The different investigators is important because we wanted to get rid of the investigator allegiance. So we didn't want one person who developed a particular treatment to be the only one that, yes, I don't know if you guys can hear that, but my cat is meowing quite loudly at me. Must be time for lunch. So we wanted to get rid of the allegiance effect, and we wanted to make sure that it's not just someone who developed the psychotherapy, to make sure that it's effective. Superior to pill or placebo. So this was to make sure that our treatments were better than, well, obviously, than the placebo or a pill. And the equivalent to an already existing treatment means that I can say that my treatment is better than a placebo, or I also can say like my treatment is as good at or better than something that's already been established in the literature. Based on the complaints from a large number of behavioral psychologists, the initial criteria also established the idea that a treatment can be validated through a number of single subject designs. This is a popular design within behavioral psychology and behavioral psychology fields, so they don't want to rule out the idea that single subject designs could be used to establish the efficacy of a particular treatment. And then these further criteria, these are really, really important. Down here, studies must be conducted with treatment manuals. This led to the proliferation of treatment manuals. You could spend thousands of dollars on treatment manuals out there. We've got a bunch of them. You're going to have an assignment that you're going to review one of them. But there are a lot of treatment manuals that say, look, if you're doing this treatment for anorexia, here's the treatment choice. This is effective. Here's the manual you want to use. One of the things for me that I complain about is that it costs you a lot of money. If you think about all the DSM diagnoses and all the treatments that have been established to treat them, if you wanted to treat them and you wanted a manual, think about how much money you would have to spend on each of those particular manuals, not to mention learning them each and learning to be proficient with them. I'll get off my soapbox. The other characteristic in here was that the client samples need to be clearly specified. And the idea here is a standard kind of psychological research one. We want to know who these studies are generalizable to. And obviously, as we'll continue to talk about, one of the problems with that is that a large number of these were done, conducted with, and supported or validated, or whatever you want to call it. A large amount of that research was done on affluent white populations. And so that kind of limits some of the generalizability, but it also allows us to know what the generalizability is. So there's a dual side to that coin. So the initial Division 12 task force established these kind of well-established treatments. They also established these probably efficacious treatments. And probably efficacious was we had one group design. It was done by the same investigative team. Maybe it didn't have a treatment manual, or the treatment manual was poorly supported or poorly put together. And by the way, the treatment manual, the whole idea there was we need to be able to replicate this, right? If you tell me this treatment is effective, but you don't tell me what the treatment is, well, what the hell good does that do me? So the treatment manual, the idea was that if I prove this treatment to be effective, then you have the ability to replicate that in your own practice. So any number of these factors that might not be done to the level that this task force said, and those treatments would be deemed probably efficacious. And that's it. And you saw in your reading the initial group of efficacious and probably efficacious treatments were largely cognitive behavioral, which caused a great deal of controversy. But at the very least, in the 80s and 90s, we had a group of treatments that, like, okay, I could do this. If someone has chronic pain, here's a treatment that I could pick. There's good empirical support. I can move forward. In the next series of lectures, we'll talk about this new model developed by Tolan and now adopted by Division 12 that looks at some of the problems with this initial model and attempts to fix how we think about empirically supported treatments. All right, I'm a little over 30 minutes, which is what I try to keep these to, so I'm going to stop there and get this published.